let's get this party started. Let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Jason Grissom, so that way he can lead us in the presentation and kick us off. So Dr. Jason Grissom is a Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Public Policy and Education of Political Science at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. He also serves as Faculty Director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, a research policy practice partnership that produces research to inform Tennessee's school improvement efforts. An interdisciplinary scholar, Professor Grissom's work applies perspectives from political science, public administration, and economics to the study of school and district leadership, educator mobility, educational equity, and the intersections among the three. His research typically makes use of large-scale administrative and survey data, often supplemented with data from interviews and observations to answer questions in these areas. He has ongoing research projects on the impacts of school leader diversity, the measurement and evaluation of principal job performance, and how principals make human talent management decisions in their school. So that kind of gives you some context already in terms of what he's going to be talking about. Dr. Jason Grissom is the co-author of a report from the Wallace Foundation titled How Principals Affect Students and Schools, a systematic synthesis of 2 decades of research. Here to kick off our event with an overview of the research and its conclusions about the impact of principals and why they are so critical for student outcomes, please welcome Dr. Jason Grissom.
Thanks, Jeremy. A very kind introduction. So I'm Jason Grissom from Vanderbilt, and I have studied school leadership for more than a decade. In fact, school leadership is a major focus of the work that we do at the Tennessee Education Research Alliance that we call TERRA. And that research has included work on principal effects and on schools and on teachers, on students, on principal evaluation, principal mobility, and some of the other topics that Jeremy mentioned. And so I think partly as a result of having that 10 years of work, the Wallace Foundation commissioned me and 2 of our co-authors to take on this comprehensive synthesis of what we know about how principals affect schools. This is actually the first of 3 syntheses that the Wallace Foundation was releasing this year. One on principal effects, that was ours. The second one is on the role of the assistant principal. That one actually just came out. And then there'll be a third one that's about principal pre-service and in-service professional development opportunities. So if you're interested in taking a look at the synthesis, the link is there on the title slide. It's at wallacefoundation.org/principal synthesis. But I'm going to give you a sense of some of the major findings from that report. And so there was a major report that was commissioned by the Wallace Foundation back in 2004 called How Leadership Influences Student Learning. And that report really highlighted the importance of school leadership for the field. And the reason that we took this synthesis on at this time is that a lot has changed since that report was released. There's been a lot of changes in the policy landscape for school leaders. So, the rise of high stakes accountability systems and increased focus on engagement with instruction, the rise of multiple measure educator evaluation systems, and so forth. And so the policy landscape has really changed. At the same time, there have been a lot of changes in the research landscape. There's a lot of new data that we didn't have in the early 2000s. We have new methods that we didn't have in the early 2000s. And so that's given us more tools to be able to investigate the relationship between school leadership and student achievement. And so revisiting this role of leadership for schools was really a timely endeavor. So our goal here was to synthesize what's been learned in the last 20 years about the relationship between school leadership and student achievement and other outcomes beyond achievement as well, as you'll see. And so give you a sense of the key takeaways, and then I'll dive a bit into the details. So the first takeaway from the report is the studies using these new data and methods that I was just talking about show that how important school principals are may not have been stated strongly enough in prior work, given the magnitude and also the scope of their impacts. I'll talk a bit about that on a range of outcomes. We also find that evidence links 4 domains of behaviors to positive outcomes for students in schools, and that those behaviors include but go beyond engagement with instruction, which I think is the sort of the dominant narrative around principal leadership. But instruction is important, engagement with instruction is important, but other things are important as well. We find that the principalship needs continued reorientation toward educational equity, and also that we need renewed attention to supporting a high quality principal workforce. And I'll tell you a bit about how we get to that conclusion. So we went into the report with 3 research questions. The first of those is, who are public school principals in the United States, and how have their characteristics changed over the last few decades? Then we ask, how do principals contribute to student achievement and other school outcomes? And third, what matters in the role of the principal? So what are effective principals' characteristics? What are their skills? What are their behaviors? And so for this first question, we analyzed nationally representative data that track principals' characteristics and placement from a 1988-89 school year to the 15-16 school year, which was the most recently available data that the federal government produces. And I'm actually not going to talk about the results from research question 1 just for time, but can refer you to the report if you're interested. There are a lot of interesting findings about how the principalship has changed. I'm going to focus more on questions 2 and 3. And to answer these questions, what we did is we conducted a systematic search of scholarly databases and what are called gray literature. So gray literature are things that are not published in academic journals. They're policy reports, high quality work that had been put out by think tanks and so forth. And so we pulled those into the synthesis as well. And that initial search yielded close to 5,000 studies. And then we went through this process of screening them for relevance, for rigor, for the appropriateness of the methodology. And ultimately, we winnowed that set of 5,000 down to 219 studies that form the basis of the synthesis that I'm going to talk about. So let me tell you what the main findings were. I'm going to start with this question 2, how much do principals contribute to student achievement and other school outcomes? And then I'll go into this secondary question of what matters in the role of the principal. So the main finding, the main sort of top line conclusion from for question 2 is that there's strong evidence that having an effective principal contributes substantially to student achievement. And what I want to do is dive into the evidence that leads us to that conclusion. So for this chapter of the report, we rely primarily on 6 studies we identified in our literature search that aim to identify principals' effects. So we focus on these 6 studies specifically because they use the best available methods. They rely on longitudinal administrative data from states or large school districts. And together, those 6 studies make use of data on more than 22,000 principals. So together, it's quite a large data set that's being drawn on. And what sets these studies apart is that they can follow many principals and schools over time. So they observe what students learn in the same schools when they're led by different principals. And also because principals move around among schools, they also observe what students in different schools learn when those schools are led by the same principal. And so when you put those 2 facts together, then the studies can use advanced statistical methods to tease out principals' effects on student achievement growth. And really, these studies provide the best evidence that we currently have for quantifying how much principals matter. So these studies provide sort of a range of estimates of those effects, but when we look across the 6, we estimate that increasing principal effectiveness by 1 standard deviation results in an achievement increase of 0.13 standard deviations in math and 0.09 standard deviations in reading. And so now the question in your mind is, what does that mean? Can you translate that into non-researcher speak? Standard deviations are just a statistic that the researchers use. They don't have a lot of intuitive meaning. And so what I want to do for you is translate what those effects mean into something that's a bit more interpretable. And so for that translation, what I want to do is a little thought experiment. So picture a distribution of principal effectiveness shown here on the screen, where effectiveness here is defined at how good a principal is at raising student achievement. And so what you see on the screen is a classic sort of bell-shaped distribution. Principals whose effects fall on the left side are not as good at raising student achievement, and principals on the right are stronger. And most principals fall near the middle, which is why the distribution is taller, sort of at the average. And so the thought experiment is, suppose a school has a principal who is below average. So let's say they're at the 25th percentile in terms of how good they are at raising student achievement. Now, suppose we replace this principal with someone who is above average, meaning that they're at about the 75th percentile in effects on student achievement. And that could happen in a couple of ways. You could actually replace the principal, or you could find ways to improve the performance of the below average principal, and you would arrive at the same spot. And so then the question is, if this replacement happened, what would be the effects? Well, our estimates suggest that we would see the learning of the average student in this school increase by just shy of 3 additional months of learning annually with the above average principal. And that's really quite a large effect. So an important thing that we want to highlight here is that these estimates are average student level effects. meaning that they're the effects of on every student that an educator works with in a year. All right. And why that is relevant is when we think about sort of teacher effects are larger, like the impact of an individual teacher on a kid is larger, but an individual, in fact, they're about 4 months. If you make the same kind of translation of 25th to 75th percentile, what you get is 4 months of learning for the average kid. And so teacher effects are larger, and that's what you would expect. Teachers are closer to kids. But also in the typical elementary school classroom, a teacher is teaching 21 students, whereas the typical elementary school principal is affecting 483 students. All right. And so that's where we arrive at this conclusion that not only are our principal's effects large in magnitude, they're also large in scope. Okay, that scope means the number of kids that are impacted. And moreover, we document that there's substantively important impacts of effective principles on a range of other outcomes that go beyond achievement. So the research documents that effective principles are associated with lower absenteeism and chronic absenteeism. They're associated with improved teacher reports of their working conditions and survey reports of teachers' job satisfaction. That more effective principals see reduced teacher turnover in their schools, and that reduced turnover is particularly sort of concentrated among more effective teachers. And so principles are really important. And in fact, in the report, we conclude that it's difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership. So that's question 2. All right, that's the sort of the answer to question 2. How big are principal effects? They're big. They're big in magnitude, they're big in scope, and they're visited on a range of outcomes, including achievement, but going beyond achievement. So principles really matter. And so then what we wanted to dig into is, well, how do they matter? And what we find, this is research question 3, what we find in the review of the literature here is that some leadership skills and behaviors are associated with better outcomes. And I want to tell you sort of how we group those skills and behaviors. This was a lot of the work of the synthesis to make a lot of meaning out of these 219 studies, pull them together, figure out what they were telling us that's sort of in common. And so, and this is a body of work that's really diverse. So our synthesis of the research on principal skills identifies 3 primary skill areas that principals need for success. And these are skills around people, so human development and relationship kinds of skills, skills around instruction, so skills to support what teachers are doing in classrooms. And third, what we call skills around the organization. So these are management skills that would be required to run any complex organization that sort of transcend the skills necessary to run a school. And so these skills are often overlapping. They're also, this is not exhaustive, but this is the list these domains are sort of the ones that are most clearly supported by the weight of the evidence. And so these 3 sets of skills combine to support 4 domains of high leverage principal behaviors. So the first of those is what we call engaging in instructionally focused interactions with teachers. And that is sort of a tweak on the idea of instructional leadership that's really around working directly with teachers on their instructional practice. So this is around use of evaluation, feedback and coaching, use of data for teacher improvement, and the like. The second one we call building a productive climate. So these are practices that encourage building a school environment that has positive characteristics like trust, efficacy, teamwork, engagement with data, organizational learning, continuous improvement, and these sort of related positive climate characteristics. The third we call facilitating collaboration in professional learning communities. So these are strategies that promote teachers working together authentically with systems of support to improve their practice and enhance student learning. And the last one is managing personnel and resources strategically. So these are strategic engagement with resources. And one of the major resources that principals have are personnel, right? So this includes like strategic staffing, strategic hiring and placement of teachers, strategic retention, but also the strategic allocation of other resources to pursue school goals. And so what we observe is that principals who consistently engage in these 4 leadership behaviors see more positive outcomes in their schools and among their students. Now, obviously, their local context is really important here. And so what particular skills and behaviors are valuable is going to depend a bit on their school and their local context. But this is sort of looking across what the weight of the evidence suggests are the domains of behavior that are most consistently associated with positive outcomes. The other thing that we do in the report that I want to mention is really try to take an equity perspective and highlight how principals can have impacts on key student populations, including students of color, low-income students, and English learners. And there's an extended discussion on this in the report if you're interested, but just to give you a sense, what we find is that the channels for principals' effects on these key populations are both direct and indirect. So direct are examples like principals pursuing equity in student disciplines is a place where principals interact with students directly. And so this is how they mete out discipline, their discipline policies are sort of a direct way that an equity-focused school leader can affect kids' outcomes differentially across subgroups. But also there are lots of important indirect channels as well. So how principals work with teachers to implement culturally responsive teaching practices, how they hire greater numbers of teachers of color, their purposeful engagement with a diverse range, pulling a diverse range of families into the life and the work of the school. And so what we find here, so what we argue is for this kind of emerging framework that inserts an equity lens into that broader set of skills and leadership behaviors that I was talking about just a second ago, that principals who develop this equity lens are able to interpret these leadership behaviors in a way to enhance equity in their schools. So for example, an equity-focused school leader might approach building a productive climate with all students in mind. And so, climate strategy in this, building strategies for building a climate in this positive climate with this sort of equity lens in mind might include celebrating diversity, consistently communicating high expectations for all students, including those from historically marginalized populations, intentionally building opportunities for teachers and families and the communities to work together to meet students' needs, and so forth. And so really this equity lens, we think, is really important for the field to develop going forward in thinking about how principals impact schools. Another thing I'll just mention is that we find that principal racial and ethnic diversity is sort of a central part of this equity story, as we have this rapidly diversifying student population, that is creating this growing mismatch between the race and ethnicity of students and of principals, also teachers, but focused here on principals. And that's an important policy target for states and districts to think about in pursuit of an equity agenda. And so this is the last slide. There's a need for lots of other of research in this area, but that need notwithstanding, the conclusions of our report have lots of implications for the field, and I just want to highlight what 3 of those are. First, the magnitude and scope of principal effects on a range of outcomes argues for the need to invest in strategies to ensure that every school has an effective principal, and that includes efforts to cultivate, to select, to prepare, and to support a high-quality principal workforce. Second, our results suggest that those strategies will be more effective if they focus on building principals' capacity, their skills and behaviors in these high leverage areas, meaning skills and behaviors that are most clearly associated with better school outcomes. And so pre-service preparation programs, principal pipeline initiatives, in-service learning for principals can have more positive effects when they focus where the research points for what principals need to know and what they need to be able to do. And then finally, our report argues for continued reorientation of school and district leadership towards educational equity. That principals need to develop this equity lens, they need to prioritize the needs of an increasingly diverse student body, and that districts and states need to ensure that principals have opportunities to develop that lens and have the tools to focus on the needs of diverse learners. They also need to ensure equitable access to principal roles for leaders from diverse backgrounds. And I want to mention that we have active research on these topics at the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. And we would love to bring, folks from Tennessee into that work, Memphis area folks into that work. So please reach out. So I thank you for your attention. And now I'll turn back over to Jeremy to moderate the panel.
Yeah, I mean, this last slide that he was showing will lead us perfectly into the conversation. And one, thank you, Jason, for sharing. I think all of you can see just in and of itself, that could be a whole panel discussion just on its own and a whole presentation that we could dive much deeper into. But we felt it was important, one, to lay the groundwork and the context you understood one, just the research and its findings, because it is important. And we talk about leadership at a corporate level, at a political level. And when you talk about education, it's so important. So to lay that context, thank you, Jason. Absolutely amazing. So let's go ahead. And what I'm going to do is ask our panelists to go ahead and turn their cameras on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them one at a time. So I'll do an official introduction, and then I'm going to ask them as a part of that, and Gene will be the first one, but I'm going to ask them to give a little bit of a glimpse into their world. So talking about their organization, their role, so that way you have some context from them in terms of their perspective and the way that they view this conversation. So starting out, Gene Desravines, he's the CEO of New Leaders, a national nonprofit organization that develops school and system leaders in 20 urban cities and 15 states. Recently, he launched a partnership with Morehouse College to create a fully online certification and master's program in education leadership that will serve as a profit center for the college, focused on both the B2B and B2C recruitment strategy. So he's really expanding out when you talk about the education and that sort of ROI. Prior to New Leaders, Gene served as a senior advisor to New York City Schools Chancellor Joel Klein in the Bloomberg administration and launched a $50 million program to hire 1,200 plus staff. Gene has been named to Forbes Impact 30, which recognizes the world's leading social entrepreneurs from across the country. He's the co-author of 2 books, Breakthrough Principles and the School Leadership Playbook. So Gene, share a little bit of your world from the New Leaders perspective.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Jason shared the powerful research. What I'll do is actually start quickly by sharing a personal story, why this work is so important to me, tying it into our work at New Leaders. When I was 17 years old, my high school principal changed the trajectory of my life. When I was 17, my father passed away. My mother, who was with my father for 42 years, had a mental breakdown. She was institutionalized. I went to my high school principal, Dr. Lorenzetti, and said, I've got to drop out. I need to find a job, a place to live. And Dr. Lorenzetti said, absolutely not. You are capable of great things. I will help you find a job, find a place to live, but you will not drop out of high school. He changed my trajectory. That is what we do at New Leaders. We identify, develop, and support Dr. Lorenzetti's to go into schools. For the past 20 years, we have developed over 4,000 leaders, including 1,000 principals in over 20 school districts, impacting over 500,000 students. Those principals have significantly outperformed their peers in math and reading. They retain far greater numbers of teachers, and now they're driving systems outcome. In Shelby County, where we've been since 2004, we've developed over 250 leaders, including 35 sitting principals. 20% of all Shelby County principals are New Leaders trained principals. And since 2015, half of all of Memphis schools on the National Blue Ribbon list, which is the prominent list of high growth schools, are led by New Leader principals. I share that to give you an overview of the work we've done nationally, the work we're doing in Shelby County, because in this moment in time, with the level of investment that's being made through the American Rescue Plan, and as districts across the country are thinking about how do you drive impact at scale, there is no better investment to make than investing in school leadership, because they create the culture, they set the vision, they identify the teachers, and in essence, as Jason pointed out, both research and our experience have shown there is not a single instance of a high performance school without a great principal.
The beautiful thing is we get to touch on the district level and then the school level as a part of this panel discussion. And so we're honored, and you'll see throughout new leaders is woven into this. And I'm going to let Rodney and Archie kind of share their stories too. But really amazing when you look at the impact new leaders is having. And Barbara and myself are even connected as well. So I'm going to introduce Rodney Rowan. He's the Assistant Superintendent, Continuous Improvement Zone with Shelby County Schools. So we're looking at this from the district level. And he's highly regarded as a new leaders alum. I first got to know Rodney when he was the principal of Cherokee Elementary and helped lead his school from being labeled a priority school to being recognized and highly regarded for their academic gains, percentage of teachers being rated a level 5, which is the highest possible effectiveness rating on Tennessee's TVOS teacher evaluation system, and their culture of accountability and success. So Rodney is someone who knows leadership and how to build and train a team, and that's exactly what he's now doing district-wide, which is really amazing. So Rodney, give us a little bit of your vantage point in your world.
So to Jeremy's point, I'm Rodney Rowan, the Assistant Superintendent of the Continuous Improvement Zone. This is like a subset of schools that were once in the I zone, but the schools have exited the I zone. And the Continuous Improvement Zone is the safety net, and schools stay in the Continuous Improvement Zone 3 years before they go back into the traditional school setting. So just bringing you forward around my leadership ideologies and beliefs, I just want to give you a little bit of information about just me as a person. I was a classroom teacher in legacy Memphis City schools for 9 years. And the schools that I taught in were all in urban inner city settings. I was an assistant principal 3 years. 3 of those years, I was in an urban inner city setting. Resident principal, 1 year, I was at an IB school, and I served as a principal for 7 years. And my experience as a principal was in an urban inner city setting. Some of the schools that I'm responsible for leading right now are schools that I attended. So as a leader, I understand some of the barriers that school leaders face when you're working with students that are in urban inner city locales. So as a senior leader in the district now, I understand the importance of building teacher capacity. I understand the importance of articulating a clear vision. And a vision is nothing more than a clearly articulated path to the future. I understand and valuing the culture of the community and the culture of the students and the people on my staff. Culture just meaning understanding people have different attitudes, beliefs, and values. All of these things are important. But at the end of the day, it's about putting children first. All that we do in service, and we do in service for children. So I'm excited about being here today. I can tell you that I am the Assistant Superintendent of the Continuous Improvement Zone, but at my core, I'm Rodney Rowan, and I am a teacher in Memphis Shelby County School System.
Love it. Next up, Dr. Archie Moss Jr. He's the principal of Bruce Elementary School with Shelby County Schools. He's a shining light as a New Leaders alum as well. You've seen him featured on national television shows for his approach of doing whatever it takes to see his scholars succeed, which includes starting a basketball league, reading bedtime stories virtually, starting a mentorship program called the Gentleman's League, and more. He makes sure that he knows all of his scholars' names and their stories, and he is a hands-on educator creating transformation with his school. So, Dr. Archie Moss, give us a little bit of your world, buddy.
Well, thank you for number one having me. So honored to be here with all these amazing people. As I mentioned, Dr. Archie Moss Jr., proud principal here at Bruce Elementary School. This is my 5th year here. I tell everyone that I'm originally from Miami, Florida, so I'm not a Memphian by choice. I say that I didn't choose 901, 901 chose me. I actually had the opportunity of starting my educational journey in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was a middle school math teacher. I actually had the opportunity of participating in New Leaders, Emerging Leaders program when I was still in the classroom to help build my leadership abilities while I was still having the opportunity to teach my scholars. And I think that's what opened my eyes to the greater impact that I might be able to have outside the classroom, which sparked my interest in leaving the classroom. I served as a dean of students at my same school before making the transition to come over to Memphis. And I think my story here in Memphis has just blossomed as time went on. I actually served as the resident principal at the middle school that my students currently matriculate into. And so we actually share the same lot. And so I think it was just a magical experience for me to be able to serve at Bellevue Middle School and now have the opportunity to be at Bellevue, to be at Bruce Elementary School, where never thought I would be in elementary school. I'll say that. My experience has always been in middle school, but I think now that I've been in elementary school, I found out that elementary school is where I can start and build that foundation. And that's actually one of the models that we created here at Bruce, is that we're building a foundation for a better tomorrow. And so, yes, I'm a principal here on this panel. So I'm on the ground doing the work over the course of my 5 years. When I first took over here at Bruce, we were one of the schools that was in the bottom 10% in the state of Tennessee. And that was something that sparked a sense of urgency, and not only myself, but with my staff. And so I knew that I had to do work to make sure that we continue to push our students, because the talent was here. Our students are great, our community is great, and we just had to continue to do the work. And so, as Jeremy mentioned, I am one of those hands-on principals that there isn't a job or a task that I won't do for my kids or my community, because ultimately my motto, my goal is to make sure that all my kids feel seen, heard, and deeply known. And I think that motto is what has allowed me and my school community to continue to grow and to continue to flourish. And so again, I'm thankful to be here and thankful to engage in this conversation.
Love it. Next up is Barbara Rosser Hyde. She's the chair and CEO of the Memphis-based Hyde Family Foundation, where she is a passionate advocate for education reform nationally and a leader for place-based philanthropy in the city that she and her husband call home. She spent her entire career in the nonprofit work, bringing her experiences to bear in leading the foundation's priorities, strategies, results, and direction. Its objectives include ensuring all children have access to a great education, investing in Memphis's urban core and authentic quality of life assets, and creating livable communities for all Memphians. And so, Barbara, give us a little bit of your vantage point personally and obviously professionally on your end with the foundation.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I am really humbled to be on this panel with these people who are doing this work on the ground, hands-on, pushing the needle. So grateful for the opportunity to join you all this morning. So as Jeremy said, I've worked with the Hyde Family Foundation for almost 30 years now, and we're a place-based foundation focused entirely, almost solely on Memphis, Tennessee. We focus on what are the levers that we can drive to create a thriving and unified Memphis for all? And obviously, education is top on our list, a key lever for that change. Just speaking personally, the hardest job I've had in my entire career was my first job after college, which was teaching school in a Harambee school in Kenya. And that was the hardest thing I've ever done. And it was supported by a wonderful principal. And so I've been the beneficiary of great principals in my own education. I couldn't cut it as a teacher. So kudos to Archie and Rodney. I had to retire from that and move on to something easier like philanthropy. But I learned at that time hands-on how much it means to have a great leader. And since then, and I'll talk about this more later, we've realized the importance of investing in principal leadership, and I'll save that for later on, Jeremy.
So here's where on our end, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and put in the chat box in the Q&A. If you have questions, we're going to kind of start shifting over, but I'm going to throw this first question out, and really, I'm going to leave it for each of you. You can answer, but talk about it from your vantage point, going back to the last slide that Jason was sharing, and share a little bit of your firsthand experience when it comes to affecting student achievement. So when you look at the skill sets that you learned through new leaders, when you look at obviously being boots on the ground as an assistant principal, as a principal, now obviously, you know, at a higher level, even on your end, Rodney, talk about from your vantage point, specifically what you've been able to see regarding the impact of that principal role in affecting student achievement. So that drip down to where it makes the difference with the students. So I'll leave it open. Rodney, Archie, Jean, kind of share, and even Jason too. Go ahead and I'll let you take it away. So whoever wants to dive in first can take first dibs. Otherwise, I'm going to start calling out.
Rodney or Archie, it would be great if you can start at the micro level to talk about it from a principal's lens. And then I'll talk about it at a macro level in terms of what it means across for Shelby County and across the country.
Yeah, let's work our way up. So that's a good idea. So Archie, you take it first, buddy, on what you're seeing right now in terms of your ability as the principal to specifically impact student achievement. So we'll let you take it away.
So I think one of the main missions of new leaders is that leadership matters. And so depending on what the vision that I set for the school is going to dictate the success of the school. And so I think the first thing that I had to do when I took over here at Bruce was to make sure that the vision of the community and the vision that the school had was the direction I felt like the school could go in to truly impact student achievement. And so I think with new leaders and the training that I received with new leaders, it was all about making sure that we have a sense of urgency as relates to addressing the academic needs of all the kids here, but also making sure that we cultivate a strong culture. And so I think what I had to start off doing was making sure that I address both of those at the same time. We have to make sure that we are making sure that we have a strong academic press, that we are making sure that we are focusing on those standards, improving literacy, which is the area that we've been working on, that we're continuing to work on since I've been here, is just strengthening early literacy and making sure that our students can leave reading on grade level. But I think we also had to make sure that school was an opportunity and was a place where students were excited to come to each and every day. And so I think ultimately it was all about, as I said, setting that vision, making sure that I created a culture where everyone understood the importance of this work, and then cultivating all those leaders around me. So I think I couldn't do this work on my own. I had to make sure that the training that I experienced, that my team, my admin team, that my teachers, they all were privy to that same level of professional development so that we as a school community could lead the way. And so I think ultimately, as a principal, I have to be the visionary and I had to lead by example. And so oftentimes, as you mentioned, Jeremy, I'm very hands-on. I do that intentionally to show my staff that there isn't anything that I will not do for my kids, so that in turn, they'll have those same techniques and tactics and strategies as they go the extra mile to impact the lives of our kids. And so I think ultimately making sure that we have an all hands on deck approach and that I am leading that charge. I'm tutoring kids in the morning. I am having after school activities. I'm trying to lead the cultural aspect of the school so that it can inspire all those around me to kind of lead and do the same thing as well.
I'm gonna, before we switch over to Rodney, this comes in from Charlotte as a question for you, Dr. Moss. Please share your exciting student capacity building initiative turnaround room.
Yes, so actually this is an opportunity, an initiative that we've been starting again, now more than ever with COVID and with us experiencing students coming in with experiencing a lot of trauma. We have about 10% of our population here at Bruce that are temporarily homeless or displaced. And because of that, we know they're coming to school with a lot of baggage each and every day. And so we have transformed our turnaround room as an opportunity to, we call it turnaround room because it's set to turn around those behaviors. If scholars are having issues, behavior, if they're having emotional outbursts, we send them to the turnaround room, which is what we would consider like our mindfulness room. So typically it's an opportunity where we have flexible seating. We're really excited that the Memphis Rotary Club chapter has just sponsored our room to kind of provide additional resources. So we have mindfulness books and materials in there. We have infusers in the room to kind of help to set the tone. And it's an opportunity for our scholars to be able to talk through whatever those emotions that they're experiencing so that ultimately we can turn around those behaviors and get them right back to the classroom. Because again, we want to make sure that those students have the opportunity and the platform to be able to express themselves, express what areas they're struggling with so that we can be able to rally behind them and be able to provide whatever support to them. And so we've seen that because of that turnaround room, number one, we've been able to decrease the amount of students that we've had to suspend, but we've also been able to provide those kind of wraparound services for our students, where the students feel as though when they come to school, they're going to get the help that they need, and we get them right back in the classroom because they're not going to learn to read by being at home. We have to make sure that we find ways to be able to work with our students within the school building, and so that turnaround room has been one of our initiatives to be able to get them that support that they need so that we can talk through those issues, give them those plans to support them, and then get them right back in the classroom.
Yeah, that was a great question. And also too, a great tie-in to exactly when you talk about affecting student achievement and also collaboration in the community. I mean, that's the perfect example of everything we're talking about. Rodney, go ahead and dive in terms of what you've seen for the impact for student achievement. And yeah, I'm not going to throw you a curveball yet, so go ahead and start that one.
Okay, okay, kind of excuse me, my sinuses have been draining this week, but it's getting better every day. So as I lead into this conversation, I think about a quote, and the quote states that a great teacher is one who never forgets what it was like to be a student, and a great leader, principal, is one who never forgets what it was like to be a teacher. And now that I'm working from the district perspective, I've never forgotten what it was like to be a student, a teacher, or a principal. With that said, the one thing that I feel that is most important when doing this work, to Archie's point, is establishing the right culture. You have to have insight around the demands and the needs of that unique principal, the unique school, and have lots of introspect around how the district operates as well. So Dr. Grissom shared like the bell curve, and I thought that was like the perfect graphic to show, because when you look at a bell curve, you're going to have a concentration of people that will be on the left of the bell curve. Some will be to the right, and the right is always good, right? And some fall in the middle. So as a leader, as a principal, when you're walking into that building, you have to assess where the majority of the people, where the teachers are concentrated in that building. Are they concentrated to the left of the curve? Are they at the middle of the curve, or to the right of the curve? And if you have teachers that are to the right of the curve, if I have principals who are on the right of the curve, then I have to leverage them. I have to use them to leverage the other people within the division that we're working in. But we also have to have baseline data. So as we're looking at that baseline information, this is baseline data for students. What do you bring to the table? What do you come to us with? So that we now know how to better build you. We have to assess teachers. What do you bring to the table? So that we can build your capacity. And that same work is done with school leaders as well. So from a district's perspective, I spend 80% of my time in a building, in a school building, every day, side by side with principals and school leaders doing this work. That's the only way you're going to change it. You can't do this work if you're not in this work. So we can talk about a lot of the nuances around high quality PD. We can talk about data-driven instruction. We can talk about culture and climate. Leadership is adaptive work, and it's situational. And you have to be very, very flexible. And you have to be able to effectively communicate. And communication doesn't always mean that you're saying the right thing. Communication means that your reactions and your behavior and your physical presence is there as well. So, I mean, we can have a lot of conversations around leadership. I can tell you about ways to analyze. I can tell you ways about disaggregating. But the one thing that I can tell you is that the way that you create change is by caring and being present and being a person who not only has the ability to tell people what to do, but you have to be able to model the way as well. Thank you.
You actually answered my curveball question, which was going to be talking about the transition and some of those skill sets. So great job on that. Gene, share from your perspective on the new leader side, share your perspective on affecting student achievement.
Sure, Jeremy. If we think about this for a second, if you look at any organization, think of a great company, the military, a great nonprofit, the single biggest differentiator between being mediocre or being great is the quality of the leader. And when you think about schools, schools are no different because leadership matters. Archie and Rodney actually alluded to this. There are a set of traits and characteristics that needs to exist. One is around your ability to set a clear, inspiring vision. The second, and both Archie and Rodney underscore at this point, is how do you create a culture of high expectations for everyone in that building, irrespective of social economic status, irrespective of race. And then there are three elements that's so critically important, which Jason alluded to in his research. One is around how do you organize the school? Second is around the human capital. How do you maximize the ability of your teachers and every single person in that school building in service of kids? And finally, how do you have an instructional lens that is focused on ensuring that for every second of that day, you are positioning your kids to be able to learn to their maximum capacity. You are preparing your teachers to equip them to have the tools to ensure that they are teaching our kids. So in sum, when you think about this, we can go into any school district and go to a classroom to show an effective classroom. But when you want to drive outcomes at scale, and when you look at Shelby County, for example, with approximately 150 to 200 schools, the only way you will drive outcomes at scale is by ensuring you have a great principal in every single school.
Give us a little bit, I'm gonna throw you a curveball, Gene, but I think it translates over perfectly. And Archie, I think, mentioned this on his end is you've got to create that culture, that system approach to engaging the teachers right off the bat. And when you look at new leaders, there's been a lot of flexibility and adaptation in partnership with Shelby County Schools in looking at the network. So now, not just necessarily training the principal, the assistant principal, it's how do we create a network so that there are more stakeholders in the school engaged in this leadership and this training and this rigor and everything, so that you can, to your point on scalability, you can move so much faster because now you're bringing in the network and a cluster to be able to create the change. So talk about some of the adaptation already, the innovations, if you will, that new leaders is going through, and then we'll kind of let Rodney and Archie talk about this too.
It's a brilliant question, Jeremy, because we talk about culture. What we have not done enough, we've been focused on school culture, but what we have not talked enough about is the culture of school systems, meaning the district, right? If you're going to drive success and outcomes at scale, you need to create the right enabling conditions within school systems, within the network, to allow principals, teachers to thrive. We have been fortunate enough, based on the work that has happened in partnership with Shelby County, we've been here for now over 16 years. And during that time, a number of our principals have been promoted to principal supervisors, the chief academic officer. So Rodney, as an example, we're working with Rodney and his team to not only work with a school, but to work with a system of schools, to work with a network of schools. And we've been fortunate enough to work with the chief academic officer, former new leader, along with the superintendent, to try to share some of our insights, our learnings, our best practices, to embed that within the district, to try to move change, not only at the school level, but at the entire system level.
Yeah. Archie, Rodney, do you want to add anything to that before I switch over and ask Barbara a question? No, makes it easy. All right. Good job, Gene. So Barbara, share a little bit of your vantage point from especially the funding side. What have you learned in your support and help in bringing new leaders to Memphis, supporting the program, the platform, the training, everything? What have you learned in this process and some of your takeaways for the power of not only what new leaders is doing, but leadership in education? What have you learned?
Well, let me step back just quickly to make a comment about why we believed early on that the investment would matter. I mean, it's obvious. Everybody on the panel has made it obvious, and Dr. Grissom in the report, the Wallace Foundation report, one of the great quotes: "Principles really matter. Indeed, it's difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership." So when we think about our foundation, a mid-sized family foundation dedicated to moving the needle in Memphis, we have to think about how to make every dollar matter, right? And so my husband was involved in starting AutoZone, grew that company to 6,000 plus stores now. You know, he could see from an industry point of view what a store manager does in a company like AutoZone. All of us in every walk of life see every day the impact that leadership has. So it was kind of a no-brainer early on. And in fact, New Leaders was really one of our first strategic investments. We worked hard as we were shifting our philosophy to bring new education models, new school models like KIPP. New Leaders came right after we brought KIPP to Memphis. We believed that we needed a pipeline of leaders who would address not only Memphis City Schools, Shelby County Schools, also the growing charter sector, and New Leaders has done an incredible job. So we're kind of agnostic about school models, but we believe leaders have an impact in every one of those high-performing school models. And we've learned that that is in fact the case. The schools that we've supported who have had the deepest impact on student outcomes have been schools led by New Leaders. We've also learned how it affects the whole community, how the leadership of a school not only affects the students, as Dr. Grissom pointed out, not only affects teacher retention, recruitment and retention, but actually has a ripple effect outside in the community. And we all know that schools are core assets in each of our communities. And the school leader plays an enormous role in building the culture of a community. We've also learned, I mean, we've seen where we've made mistakes around school leadership and the times when we've gone backwards in schools that we've supported. I mean, we haven't hit it right all the time. So we know how hard it is, you know, to get it right. We've been humbled a number of times on that score. So we keep coming back to how powerful the investment in school leadership is. I was remembering, I'll just share the story very quickly. I was remembering back in 2000, I guess it was probably 2003, when a team of us that included Dr. Carol Johnson-Dean, who was superintendent at the time. We brought in Congressman Harold Ford. We had the mayor. We had a huge team of Memphis leaders who were dedicated to bringing new leaders, to pitching new leaders, that Memphis was the place they should come. And we talked about, at the time, we talked about if the Grizzlies can bring Jerry West in as our general manager, then, right, Gene, then Memphis needed to have the top, the peak leadership. And that would, for us at the time, that was New Leaders. And that's proven to be the case. And I'm thrilled to hear about now 20% of the district being New Leaders led schools. And I see in the person of Rodney and Dr. Antonio Burt and leaders like Yetta Lewis in the charter sector and others, I just see it happening every day, delivering for kids on the ground.
I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions from the audience as well. So because turnaround work, this comes from Erica Lowe, because turnaround work is definitely easier said than done, what specific strategies have you used to build the trust of your teachers, students, and families? How do you keep them motivated? So let's start out. Archie, if you want to start that one, I figure you and Rodney especially can touch on that one.
Yeah. So yes, turnaround work is hard. I think that the first thing is we have to acknowledge that turnaround work is very difficult work. Our superintendent oftentimes says that this work is not just hard work, it's hard work though. And so I think we have to lead this work through our compassion, through our understanding that this is what's best for kids. And so I think I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. I lead my turnaround work because by modeling the way throughout every process. And so I think it's critical that I'm on the ground with my teachers. So whether it is me planning with them, whether it's me guest teaching, whether it's me showing them that, as Rodney kind of mentioned earlier, that I'm a teacher first. And so if there's support that's needed instructionally, I'm going to dive into that work and I'm going to make sure that I get on the ground and get my hands, feet dirty. Whether it's me helping out after school with different activities around the building. So I think, again, it's definitely modeling the way and showing them. but that followed the last end of that question is how do we keep them motivated? So I'm really big on celebrations and really big on celebrating my teachers and celebrating my students. And I think that's how I keep the morale so high within my school building, is that I'm always trying to find non-conventional ways to be able to motivate them, to be able to celebrate them. And so each morning, even during this pandemic has shown us how much motivation is needed to kind of push us through this work, because this work has been even harder now more than ever. And I think one of the things that we kind of started this school year was having some more of our motivational moments, where we sometimes have to dig deep. We have to be very authentic and be very transparent and be very vulnerable. And I think you motivate your staff by being vulnerable, by telling them what it is, by understanding them, by listening, by being compassionate, and by getting their feedback and making sure that the feedback that they provide us is actually things that we take into consideration, that we implement those changes moving forward. And so I think it's really making sure that teachers, staff, communities understand that we're in this work together. And once they see that you're working alongside them and you're not working against them, I think that you'd be surprised how far teachers, communities will go to support you, to have your back. And I think that's ultimately what was needed from year 1 to year 5. I think the culture that has been created has just continued to foster as years have gone on, but it's all about building those authentic relationships with every stakeholder, teachers, families, and students. And I think leveraging those relationships has allowed this turnaround work to not be as difficult as one might think.
Yeah, and I give you a lot of credit on the innovation side when it comes to the reading virtually, the bedtime stories, starting the basketball league, even doing music videos and creating songs, and doing anything and everything to engage your team, your students, to celebrate them and the success, but also to involve the community in that process. Rodney, what would you add in terms of the difficult work, but the important work, and how to keep the teams motivated? What would you add?
Thank you for that question. Jeremy, I think turnaround leadership, in my opinion, is something that you have to have an appetite for. So this work is it's adaptive work. And just to bring this forward, as I think about training that I received as a new leader, we learned in adaptive leadership that you have to first learn how to be uncomfortable at a rate that you can stand. That's the first and foremost. It has to happen. So SES has like a model that we use, and it's called teams, the teams model. And the teams model starts with just building capacity. So you're building capacity of students, you're building capacity of your teachers. And as a leader, I was fortunate to have new leaders to build my capacity. So my capacity is now built. And now how do I take the capacity that I have to build student capacity to build teacher capacity? You're always looking at data. What does the data say? So the data kind of gives you, it gives you more insight around how these adjustments need to be made. And when the data is trending in a positive direction, you celebrate. So when students are showing growth, you celebrate their growth. When I was at all the schools that I've been in, we would always give like these bi-weekly common assessments, because we always wanted to give them practice before we had the interim assessments. We want them to practice before they took the end of year test. And we would always celebrate students who were at the achievement mark. But if a child made like a 10-point gain, if they went from 15% to 25%, we celebrated the 10% gain, because we wanted them to understand that we know that you're trying, and we want to acknowledge your work, the work that you were doing. So really celebrating, looking at the data, the baseline data. And also, as you're looking at the data, you have to monitor progress. You have to monitor the progress of teachers. This is one thing that I've learned about leadership. I know what teachers I have in my building. I know my teachers. I know my teachers as well as I know myself. And if I know that I have students who are fragile students, and I have a teacher who's like a new and novice teacher, and that student was with the new and novice teacher that first year, and the new and novice teacher, they're learning. Then next year, I'm going to make sure that that student is with a veteran teacher who is experienced and a person who has a proven track record around moving students. So you have to know your teachers and students well enough to know if you're placing them in the right situation to be successful. And after you progress monitor, you intervene. That's the work of a leader, intervening at the point of error, celebrating when the great things are happening, and being able to be uncomfortable enough to Archie's point, to go into their classroom after you deliver high quality PD and the teacher didn't get it and model for them exactly what you've asked them to do. That's leadership. Leadership is, you cannot sum leadership up with one word. Leadership is when you start checking the boxes, it's all of the above. That's leadership.
It goes back to as well relationships, just like Gene in your story. And when you look at everything, relationships, not just with the teachers and the team, it's with the students. And one of the things that, you know, I'd share your story, Archie, but at the beginning of the year, you basically put all the students' names in a bowl and you draw it out, you know, during the week. And it's like, if you don't know that student very well and their story, then you're going to sit there and have lunch with them, sit in class with them, spend all day with them. And it's like, you make it fun, but you know, it can be a little awkward, but it's like, I'm hanging out with you, buddy, all day, you know, because I want to know you. And I think that is part of leadership and success is, to your point, Rodney, it's the relationships. It's knowing the opportunities, but the challenges that they're facing as a student so that you can be personalized with their learning experience and the teachers that you place them with and all of these different pieces and the support network they need. And it's also the relationship so that they feel valued themselves. And as all of us know, as just humans, if you feel valued and supported, you're going to try that much harder to create success, right? Because you don't want to let them down, the mentor, the teacher, the principal, the person who believes in you. And I think that's a big part of this is just the relationship element that's created. Gene, share a little bit of your vantage point with this. And I'd be curious, even Jason, a little bit of yours, but just talk about that turnaround work, motivation, success infrastructure. Give us a little bit of kind of your thoughts.
Yeah, I think Archie and Rodney, Jeremy hit it on the head in terms of all of the components. The only piece I would add is that when you look at turnaround work and you could look at all of the tactical challenges that exist around chaotic environments, lack of expectations, lack of structure, embedded within all of it is a culture that's been created of low expectations for kids and that anything is acceptable. And as any leader knows, the single hardest thing to do is to change a culture of low expectations. So when you think about turnaround work, having leaders who are adaptive, as Rodney alluded to, and who are steadfast in their beliefs that every single child can succeed and will not waver and will make the difficult decisions. Because oftentimes what happens is people will say they know what to do, they will talk about it, but are they willing to make the difficult decisions on behalf of kids rather than to benefit adults? That is a fundamental difference and why we're so fortunate to have leaders like Rodney, Archie, across the country, not only in Shelby County, willing to take on that hard work.
Jason, give a little bit of just, you know, your vantage point on this question, and then tagged with that, I'm going to add this on there. This comes from Dr. Carol Johnson-Dean. Based on what you're hearing today, what research going forward will continue to inform your work? So in other words, because you're always caught in the present, but looking forward and looking back, right? So it's like, you know, how are you kind of distilling these sort of conversations into what you're looking at moving forward? So give us a little bit of just your thoughts on motivation, the structure for success, and then obviously what this means for research moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this conversation has really highlighted is how complex this role is, right? I mean, this is maybe the hardest job in education. I mean, teaching is hard, but at least in teaching, it's bounded in the sense that you're working with, you have your set of kids in a day that you're working with, and you learn about those kids, you work with those kids, and you sort of your expectations of what you're doing with those kids are pretty clear, or at least clearer. Leaders walk into a building often at 6 o'clock in the morning and don't know what's going to happen to them during that day, right? and just sort of the level of complexity that they're dealing with is, it can be tough to plan for, right? I think the other thing that, as I'm listening to people's comments, you can see all of the requirements that are there for a leader in order to move the school forward, right? So you have to care about your kids and you have to have these authentic relationships. But that's not going to get you there with just that on its own, right? Because you're also having to attend to other pieces of the climate and culture, which relationships are a part of. But then you're in the business of driving instruction. And so then there's this element of, well, I care about the kids, I'm building the culture, but also I'm supporting my teachers and pushing my teachers in the right direction. And I'm using data, and also I have to think strategically about how I allocate my time to each one of these, these goals throughout the day. And I have to think strategically about how I'm allocating the other resources. And I'm pulling in resources from outside the school even. And I think it just really, if you're missing any one of those pieces, then you're not going to move the needle, right? And so it's almost like we've created, we have this position where we almost need superhumans to come in, right? And of course, nobody is superhuman, but the numbers of the skills and capacities that have to be built for a leader to really be successful is it's just a really, that's a just the number and the requirements. I mean, that's a real challenge. And so I think that's a lot, right? Pivoting to the research question. I mean, I think we want to, I'm interested in a lot of the details around what we've been talking about. Like we have these general ideas right now in research about, well, it's really important to build climate in a school and have this productive climate, but the how is the real question. We don't actually have a lot of direction by that. We were hearing lots of stories here, but like what can we learn by putting together these stories with stories that you accumulate in other schools to figure out sort of what works in terms of building climate as an example. So we're really interested in that, really interested in how we train and prepare people for this role and what kinds of supports and development opportunities you give to people once they're in the role so that they can be as effective as possible. And given the requirements and the complexities, how can we learn to select people for this role better? And how can we look back further in the pipeline to develop people so that, people are building competencies before they move into the position. And also we're selecting people with the right skills and capacities to go in and implement these high leverage behaviors that we've been talking about. There's lots of bright spots. New Leaders has a track record of doing this well. But we need to bring that kind of thinking, that kind of those kinds of strategies to across the education sphere, because Tennessee has 1,800 schools, right? New Leaders can't be in all of them, and we need to figure out how. Barbara says maybe they can, but we need to bring that kind of thinking and those kinds of strategies, because every kid in the state of Tennessee and in other states, but I worry about Tennessee a lot. Every kid in the state of Tennessee deserves to have a high quality leader that's running their building.
And I think from a corporate perspective, people can appreciate, you've got a good salesperson and all of a sudden you make them a sales manager. And it's like, wait a second, if they don't have the train, it's a whole different level of thinking, a whole different system approach. And so if they're not trained and equipped to take on that sort of responsibility, you're going to fall on your face. And so just because someone is a good teacher doesn't mean they're prepared to step into an assistant principal or principal role without the support, the mentorship, all of the very things that you're talking about that create the success. And so, back to the corporate world, there's so many stories that parlay. Gene, I know you had a follow-up to that, so you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Well, two thoughts now based on what Jason shared. First, we're not in all 1,800 schools yet, Jason. Give us time. Second, and more seriously, you made a point that is so important. I just wanted to underscore. Oftentimes, there is this notion that we need to find superheroes. It's not sustainable. It's not scalable. One of the things that we are incredibly proud of at New Leaders is our continuous improvement approach, coming at this with a level of humility. So while we do the work, we simultaneously work with a number of external evaluators to focus on what are we learning to not only improve our work, but to help inform the field. one of the biggest findings that we have found is that if you're going to be successful at this work, you have to have a distributive leadership model that not only focuses on finding a great leader, but equipping that leader to build a strong instructional leadership team that can take on some of that work to ensure that A, you can sustain the work, that B, the work is not dependent on one individual, and C, you have a succession planning strategy so when that leader leaves, everything doesn't fall apart. That's something that we've learned over time that is critically important, and Rodney and Archie have embodied that in terms of the teams they've built and the teams that they've supported.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. So I want to talk about something. We're going to show a video in a little bit. And one of the things that Michelle Armstrong touches on is equity. And for her, it's framed around the idea of freedom and looking at it from a freedom standpoint. And she articulates it much better. But I want to dive into this question because it really is something that, Jason highlighted in his presentation is the lens of equity, the lens of diversity. And I know that, Archie, one of the things that you getting your doctorate is you've kind of got some consulting now on the side because you see this gap of how do we get more African Americans involved in leadership. And Rodney, for you, that's a huge priority. And Jean, a huge priority so that students see themselves in their leaders, right? And so looking at it from this lens, talk about how you view diversity, inclusion, equity, social justice, tie that in. And I'm going to tie this in with the question. So I'm going to add a little bit more complexity to it. But the question is, how does new leaders and or Shelby County work to create cultural competency within its curriculum to empower students who might have been culturally erased? And so when you talk about this idea of empowering students to understand their own heritage and culture and embrace that, especially in a world that continues to be more vibrant in terms of the colors of not just the skin, but the heritage, how do you tie those elements in so that we're together, but yet we remain who we are as individuals? So Archie, you go first, buddy, on your end.
Awesome. This is an awesome question. So I oftentimes say that our kids cannot be what they cannot see. And so as we think about equity and inclusion, our students aren't going to ever know they can aspire to be more, to do more if they don't see individuals in those professions and those walks of life. And so I think, number one, as a leader of my building, it's important for me to put those images, put those narratives out in the world about what is happening with our Black and brown kids. I have a school filled with Black and brown boys and girls. I have a huge Latinx population in my building. So it is imperative that they can see themselves in the work that we're doing. And so oftentimes that was actually what sparked my interest in starting my bedtime story series. Oftentimes, some of the texts that we read within a school day, our kids cannot see themselves in the books they're reading. Therefore, if they don't see themselves, they're not engaged with it. They're not trying to make meaning of the text because they are disconnected from it. They don't feel like it's meant for them. That was the reason I started a bedtime story, so that I could bring in curriculum and books and texts that our scholars can see themselves in, so that we can build a culture of reading and a love for reading. And I oftentimes use the quote, once you learn to read, you'll forever be free. And so as we think about this idea of liberation, I know that the ability of me getting my kids to read, to increase and strengthen that early literacy is going to ultimately set them free in this world that isn't necessarily designed for their success. And so I think it is critical for me as a leader to lead the way, to be able to be the voice of reason, to make sure that I'm putting those images and putting those opportunities in front of my kids, building that exposure, making sure that we're bringing in outside resources, whether it's through the clubs, whether it's outside organizations, such as the Gentlemen's League, as I mentioned, making sure that those positive images and building the cultural competence of my staff is critical, because again, I want to make sure that each and every one of my staff members are aware of what's going on with the livelihoods of all of my Black and brown kids. And I think we have to have those conversations with not only with our teachers, but within our communities and with our students. And I think we cannot be afraid to to not engage in those meaningful conversations about our own identity, about our own biases, about our own prejudices as it relates to educating our Black and brown kids. Because I think once we have those conversations, we can dig and find out what's at the root of those mindsets so that we can make sure that everyone that's at this table is ready to serve our kids. And so I think ultimately we just have to be ready to engage in those meaningful conversations about cultural competence and continue to do this work. This isn't a one and done conversation. It is work that has to continue throughout the duration of time. And I think that's one of the things that we focus on here with my staff is that we've had cultural competence training where we're building their identities. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about self-care. We're talking about all these aspects of educating not only themselves, but our kids so that as time goes on, they're being more culturally competent so that they can be able to educate our kids a little bit better. So that our kids, as I've said before, feel seen, heard, and deeply known.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that word liberation because you'll hear that in the video. So Rodney, what would you add to that?
So, you know, Jeremy, I'm going to take a different position on the question that you just posed. Because we, at the Shelby County school system now, we have an equity officer, Dr. Michael Lowe, and we're now starting to really get involved in this work around equity. And equity means that people get what they need. We can't wait on a social studies or a history curriculum to teach Black and brown children about being a Black and brown child. You're not going to see many Black and brown people in the history book, maybe come up maybe 3 times in the curriculum in 180 days. So now we have to create, to Archie's point, those moments where and it can't just be a career day. Like we have to make sure that we have like those relationships with those external partners, having them to physically come into the school buildings so that children can begin to dream. And we have to have, it's much deeper than this conversation that we're having right now, because a lot of times our children that live in poverty, they're confined to their zip codes. Like some children have never left their zip code. Some children don't know that there's a Memphis bridge downtown. Some children don't go beyond the block that they live in their neighborhood. So I really think this is a call to action, Jeremy. And I think that's something that we need to be more intentional around doing. And we can talk about cultural competence, but how do you talk about cultural competence when some children don't know, they don't know about their culture. They don't know who they are. So I mean, this is a little bit more complex. Some children are experiencing trauma, and they don't know that they're traumatized. So like this is really deeper than this is to me. It's not a moment. This is a movement, and I think as a nation, we have to really be more intentional around identifying these movements and these moments, because our children are suffering and they're hurting, and the healing has to start, and it starts in the school. Children are there in the school building 8 hours every day. They're at home 8 hours. The body has to rest 8 hours. So the greatest influence and impact that they will have as it relates to getting that cultural competence, it starts in the school. But how do we start having conversations around creating these curriculums that teaches them about who they are and who they can dream to be?
So you might have just made this a whole series. We've turned this into one event into a series. So Gene, add a little bit of your perspective on this, and then we're going to play this video and then kind of wrap up just to keep everybody on time. But Gene, give us a little of your perspective.
It's such a powerful question. Let me just give you some quick statistics. Less than 4% of all principals across the country are Black men. Less than 20% of all principals in this country are leaders of color. And yet, 55% of our students are students of color. That disconnect speaks to part of the challenge that we face around expectations. Research shows the importance of having leaders who are proximate with lived experience. And while representation does not solve everything, representation matters, as embodied by Archie and Rodney and how they're able to articulate the work. One of the things that I'm really proud of, 90% of our Memphis alums are people of color. And it's not solely about race, it's about understanding the challenges, the impediments that oftentimes our students face, and being able to work with teachers to ensure that those impediments and challenges do not become an excuse to not ensure that you provide the highest level education as possible to change their life outcomes. Oftentimes what we see is leaders of color with the lived experience are able to provide that perspective in a way that is invaluable.
So let's do this. I'm going to ask Andrew on our end behind the scenes to go ahead and play this video. It has 3 leaders in education and supporters in terms of the philanthropy. And so you'll get a chance to kind of hear their perspective, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts.
Leadership is important. It's important for our communities. And when we think about leadership, we typically think about it in the context of political or business environments. But leadership is also crucial for the development of our children. And when we think about the greatest impacts beyond teachers in classrooms, it's the leadership in the building. It's the principal. And an organization like New Leaders is important because it allows those principals to get the support and training for them to be able to be amazing and great for our children.
This is, I think, 16 years for me as a New Leaders alum. And so it's somewhat biased in that the vantage point of New Leaders is really how I see and understand leadership. As a leader, yes, it is about how you engage and engender a shared vision among all the folks in the space. But it is also about how you empower and understand their leadership so that it is magnified, so that it is amplified, so that it's nurtured and developed for the greater good of the whole organization. It's not so much about education reform as it is about education liberation. I think the more that we position ourselves as leaders to think about what this means about liberation, it really creates a more expansive view and question around DEI even. If our work is about a liberation, it has to be diverse, right? It's about all of us. It has to be inclusive. It has to be about what this world needs to be so that we all not just survive and noted, but Tina Love, so that we all thrive. And that is more expansive than just even thinking about how we do well, on state tests. That is about how we are educating kids so that they are self-determined in their lives. As a city, we won't get beyond these hugely demarcated economic worlds in which we live and opportunities that are limited for some if we are not thinking about education in terms of liberation.
One of the most powerful experiences I ever had with New Leaders was at Ford Road Elementary. Antonio Burt was the principal leader at that point in time, and he had turned that school around in a matter of 2 short years, from being on the failing schools list to being one that was above average in the state. One of the most powerful things he ever said to me was, "Rob, we didn't change out the kids, we just changed the environment that they learn in." That was so powerful. Kids have the potential when put in environments that are led by great leaders. The leadership dimension is so important in our work here at FedEx. We value leaders that can inspire teams and create engagement and do the things that are necessary for teams to be at their best and to achieve the results that are necessary for a thriving business. That same exact dimension is true in schools as well, maybe even more so, because the team that you're leading are kids that are impressionable, they're moldable at that point in time, and they need great leaders and role models to help pull them through the process of learning and growing into young, productive parts of our society. I think one of the things that anybody loves from a philanthropic standpoint is to see their gifts matter, to see their gifts having an impact on people's lives. That's one of the things that I've personally experienced, and we've experienced here at FedEx with our gifts to New Leaders. New Leaders has an impact on kids that you can see and touch and feel, and it's powerful and rewarding.
So thank you to Michelle and Terrence and Rob for being a part of that, sharing their thoughts. But let's go ahead and wrap up. And let's start with you, Jason. We'll give each one of you a chance to kind of add your closing thoughts, your words of encouragement. So let's start with you, Jason. Give us your parting thoughts.
I mean, I don't think my parting thoughts will be new. I mean, I think this conversation has really highlighted the importance of having high quality principal workforce. Like I said a few minutes ago, every kid deserves to have a high quality leader, and figuring out how we cultivate that, how we develop people, how we select them, and how we support them to be effective in that role. That is going to be, that's a key lever for us to be successful as a public school system.
Barbara, what would you add as your parting thoughts?
Well, we've always known leadership matters. We've always known leadership is a challenge. Just to mention this moment in time, I mean, we hope, God willing, coming out of a pandemic. Archie mentioned the challenges, the learning loss that students have experienced, the social emotional challenges. Leadership is even more important now than ever. If we're to contemplate Memphis and cities like Memphis coming out of this time, this terrible time we experienced, coming out and experiencing rebirth, we have to invest in the rebirth, the learning of these students. So it's even more important now than it ever has been.
And then let's go, Archie. What's your words of encouragement, your parting thoughts?
So I'm just beyond, number one, appreciative to be able to engage in this conversation. And I always have to give credit to new leaders for the support that they provided me in my development, and the innovative nature and the innovative leader that you all see, I think came from a lot of the trainings that they pushed me into. We have to do something different. And I think, as Barbara just mentioned, now more than ever is an opportunity for us to reinvent, reimagine what schooling will look like, because schooling will never be the same ever again. And so I think it's just so critical and so important for us to listen to our kids, listen to our communities, to be able to continue to do the work, to be able to improve on the outcomes of our students. Because again, now more than ever, the work is needed to make sure that we improve those outcomes for our students, to make sure they all feel seen, heard, and deeply known.
Yeah. Rodney, what would you add?
So I would just share a quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes, and it's by Beverly Gordon. And she says that it is difficult to critique the world and work to change the world if it works for you. And I say that to say, until we are all maladjusted, and we have to be deeply maladjusted, even if it's working for us, we have to be maladjusted and work to change outcomes for children, in service to children. But it first starts with us being maladjusted. That's it. I mean, our children deserve better. They deserve better. And if we are not the ones to do it, then who will do it?
Gene, what would you add?
Powerful stuff. I just want to echo Barbara's point around the moment in time. Often in education, we talk about not having enough resources. Well, the administration through the American Rescue Plan has just allocated $122 billion with a B for K-12 education. Tennessee will receive $2.5 billion. Shelby County will receive over $500 million. We are dealing with a dual pandemic between the health pandemic and the call for racial justice. If now is not the time for us to step in, to innovate, to think differently about how to drive not only addressing learning loss, but more importantly, acceleration for all of our students, shame on us. We have the opportunity, we have the resources, we have the know-how. There's a tremendous amount of conversations around social justice, but it's imperative for all of us to know there is no social justice without educational justice. We have the opportunity to show what's possible for all of our students, irrespective of race and social economic status. It's up to us to take advantage of it and to make it possible for all of our kids.
Thank you again to our panelists for all of their amazing insight, for sharing their time, and then obviously to all of you for logging in and being with us on this experience. So we will see you again very soon. Enjoy the rest of your week and weekend ahead. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you again to our panelists.